allows us enough time to talk about scientism. So
So I guess first, like you said, we could define what scientism is, how it's used, and your arguments for it and against it.
yeah, so scientism, there are different ways to articulate scientism, and you could distinguish like strong scientism and weak scientism, all this sort of stuff. For the purposes of a critical thinking book, what I was just trying to do is help people apply the methods and tools and skills that they had learned in earlier chapters to a debate. So I wasn't going to get into all the nitty-gritty details about different ways of defining scientism, and yeah, some are going to be more plausible than others. But I just picked one version, which is not representative of all the versions that someone can take, and I wanted to apply the various methods and skills and tools of the critical thinker to this version. Okay, so the version of scientism, and here henceforth I'm just going to call it scientism. But the version of scientism on offer here is one which says that basically science is the only path to knowledge, or something like that. Alex Rosenberg defines scientism, and this is the sort of scientism that we're after here, as, quote, the conviction that the methods of science are the only reliable ways to secure knowledge of anything, end quote. So that's the sort of scientism that we're dealing with. Like, science is the only path to knowledge. The only knowledge is scientifically acquired knowledge. That's basically the thesis. So what are some motivations behind scientism? I think the most prominent motivation, in my view, is just the success of science. I mean, science, in contradistinction to perhaps most other disciplines, perhaps all of the disciplines, has been incredibly successful. It has made amazingly accurate and precise, correct predictions of antecedently surprising phenomena. It has allowed us to technologically develop in unparalleled ways. It has allowed us to land on the moon, and so on, right? So science is immensely successful, and very few people deny that science has been incredibly successful in allowing us to understand the world and manipulate the world and predict the world and, yeah, just in general, explain the goings on of the natural world. And science is also able to achieve a kind of consensus that lots of other disciplines are unable to achieve. So the thought is then that, well, given that science is so remarkably successful, especially in contradistinction to lots of other disciplines, and given that, we've got expert consensus on this, again, in contradistinction to lots of other disciplines, maybe the best explanation, maybe the only explanation for that, maybe what follows from that is that science is the only path to knowledge, the only reliable path to knowledge, the only way that we can come to know things is through science, the scientific method. So that's kind of central argument for it. Now, what are some problems for scientism? I mean, maybe we can address that argument later after I go through some of the problems with scientism. I mean, there are two main problems at the outset, and I think these are very, very serious problems for scientism. One of them is the self-defeat problem, and another one is basically just reflecting on the nature of science and its various presuppositions. So, the self-defeat problem. What is self-defeat? Well, I mean, suppose that I said that every claim that Joe makes is false. That's a self-defeating claim in that, I mean, like, if it were true, like, if we were to believe it, it would like entail its own falsity in some sense. Like, it's like into itself is false, right? It's like either, so self-undermining is basically when a claim or a view removes any justification that one could have for the view, so it entails that itself is unjustified. Whereas a self-defeating claim or view is one which entails that it itself is false. So that very claim that I made entails its own falsity, so it's a self-defeating claim. Okay. So yeah, scientism is self-defeating, or perhaps, I mean, philosophers sometimes divide up self-defeat into self-undermining and self-refutation. I actually was just using self-defeat to refer to self-refutation. It's when a view refutes itself. But technically speaking, self-defeating is when a view defeats itself. And there are actually two kinds of defeaters, a rebutting and an undercutting defeater. A rebutting defeater is when, like, you show something is false, and an undercutting defeater is when you just remove the justification for it. Okay, so technically, what I'm going to argue is that scientism entails that it itself is not a piece of knowledge and cannot be known. So in that sense, it's self-undermining. It entails that it itself couldn't possibly be known and couldn't be justifiably believed. And so in that regard, it's self-undermining, and so it's a species of self-defeat. Okay. terminological minutia notwithstanding, let's get on to the actual argument here. So yeah, again, according to scientism, right, science is the sole reliable guide to reality. But no result of empirical observation or a scientific experiment like could possibly show that to be the case, right? Like no measurements of pressure or temperature or rates of chemical change, or measurements of entropy or galactic redshift or whatever, any other physical quantity. None of that could show that science is the only source of knowledge. And so scientism itself is basically a non-scientific claim. It's a claim about the nature and limits of knowledge. It's an epistemological claim, in other words. So it's a non-scientific claim. And so given that it's not established and couldn't be established scientifically, it could only be established through non-scientific means, and it could only be justified through non-scientific means. But per scientism itself, those are not means to knowledge. They're not reliable guides to reality, right? So it entails that the only way that you could justify it is actually not a way to justify it at all. So it undermines itself. It shows, like, scientism itself is basically saying, hey, don't believe me because there's no reason to believe me, and there couldn't possibly be a reason to believe me, and we shouldn't accept views like that. So that's basically the thrust of the self-defeat problem. Scientism says that the only way to gain knowledge is through the scientific method, but the scientific method couldn't possibly justify scientism itself, that very claim, because it's a non-scientific claim. It's a claim about the nature and scope and limits of knowledge. It's an epistemological claim specifically. And so scientism itself entails that it couldn't be known, and in fact, it removes any justification that we could possibly have for it. So it's self-defeating, it's self-undermining in particular. So that's the first scientism. A pretty devastating problem. Pretty devastating problem, no. And then the next major problem is basically that science rests on various like presuppositions that have to be known in order for science to deliver any knowledge. But secondly, which can't be scientifically justified because they're presuppositions for any scientific endeavor whatsoever. So what are these sorts of presuppositions? Well, it's going to be things like the reliability of our sensory faculties, the reliability of memory, ability of reasoning itself, and so on. So science clearly couldn't establish the reliability of like memory or sensory perception because, well, spoiler alert, science relies on memory and sensory perception and so on. Right? In order to perform an experiment, you have to like observe the pressure gauge or what have you. You have to remember the observation that you made 5 seconds ago so that you can record it in your diary or whatever, or your Excel. So it would basically be like you can't use science to justify those sorts of things because it's like you're presupposing the reliability, right? So you can't like use it to show the reliability because you're just assuming it for granted. It's like circular reasoning of sorts. So then, science rests on various presuppositions. It presupposes or assumes that our memory is reliable, that our sensory experience is reliable, that our reason is reliable, and so on. And we had better know these sorts of things if we're going to know that the deliverances of science are then correct. Like if we have no clue whether or not our memory is reliable and whether or not our sense experience is actually telling us about an external world, whether we're going to have no clue about the results of science itself and about whether or not there's a pressure gauge right there. But of course, the scientismist wants to say that we do in fact know that there's a pressure gauge there and so on. So they're basically going to have to say that, yeah, we do know that we have reliable memory and sensory faculties and what have you. So these things are presuppositions of science. They couldn't be justified by science. They can't be known on the basis of science. And yet we do in fact know them, right? And that's a counterexample to scientism's claim, right? Scientism's claim is that science is the only reliable way to gain knowledge. The only kind of knowledge is scientific knowledge. But we just showed that you can't gain knowledge of the reliability of our memory and our sensory faculties through science, and yet it's nevertheless knowledge. And so it's a counterexample to scientism. The basic idea, again, is that scientism itself rests on various presuppositions, which themselves have to be known if we are to know the results of science itself. But they can't be justified or known on the basis of science because, again, they're presuppositions of science. And so not all knowledge is scientific knowledge. So those are the main problems. I mean, there are lots of more problems that I go through in the chapter. I probably go through like a dozen, to be honest. I think it's like by far the longest chapter in the book, but I use a lot of the methods and tools and skills that I'd gone through in the previous chapters to assess it. And then Yeah, going back to like the argument for scientism, that science is remarkably successful. I mean, listen, I do think that gives us a reason to think that, yeah, science is reliably latching on to various features of reality. Um, but lots of other discipline or lots of other ways of acquiring knowledge are also very successful. So testimony in general, while testimony is unreliable in certain contexts and is known to have various flaws, I'm not papering that over. But testimony in general is pretty reliable. Like, hey, I woke up this morning, or like, hey, I took a shower this morning, or like, my commute to work was less than an hour. Like things like that. People, basically everything that you're saying to everyone else is testimony, and unless we're like almost always speaking falsehoods, testimony is going to be in general reliable. So testimony is a reliable means to knowledge, and that's like not like a scientifically informed uh way of acquiring knowledge, just like you just telling me that you picked your daughter up, let's say, from school at 4 p.m. or something. um that's not, I don't come to know that through a scientific investigation. So there are lots of other non-scientific means of acquiring knowledge that are indeed successful and reliable and what have you. But well, actually, I'll just leave it at that. I mean, that suffices to address the argument. I mean, the argument said, like, in order to infer from science's success to the claim that science is the only reliable way of acquiring knowledge, you'd have to say something like, yeah, those other ways of acquiring knowledge aren't, after all, successful. Because if they were, well, then you could just use the success to reliability or success to knowledge inference to them as well. So that suffices to address that particular argument. But anyway, there's much more that can be said on these sorts of things,
I mean,
both back and forth.
one quick
Yeah,
thing
go
I'd
on.
like to say is that since like you can assess what kind of argument it is, all you have to do, kind of like what you said, you have to only find one counter uh data, right? If I find one piece of knowledge that I can find out of the scientific method, then it proves that claim false. That's all I need. I need one. I don't need 1,000. I don't need just one. That's it. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah,
like they're like, oh, it's great. I'm not denying science. It's beautiful. It's great. It's magical when it comes to results. But that claim says that there isn't any knowledge besides your ability to use the scientific method. So if I could find one piece of knowledge of whatever sort with whatever method, then that proves that claim false. That's all I need. And so sometimes
yeah,
people get caught up with like, no, literally, this is all I need. Kind of like yeah. So assessing that kind of argument, and I mean, obviously, like it's self-defeating, and it has all these kinds of assumptions that when it comes to testimonial, scientists rely on testimonial too. It's not like
yeah,
they,
exactly.
like
Yeah,
it's a very collaborative endeavor.
yeah. They
So,
themselves rely on testimony, as you're pointing out. They also rely on introspection, right? Like here's something like, I know that I'm in a little bit of knee pain right now. I know that I'm directly aware of my being in just a little bit of knee pain right now. It's not overwhelming, but just a little bit. It's a little stiff, and there's a little bit of pain in there. I didn't perform some scientific experiment for that. I didn't use anything from science on the basis of that. I'm just like introspectively aware of my qualitative pain states. And so that's obviously a piece of knowledge, but it's not scientific knowledge. And so again, it's just a counterexample. You can go through so many different ways of coming to know things, like introspection, testimony, etc. And science itself relies on these too. So I mean, the scientismist themselves has to grant that we do in fact and can in fact come to knowledge through these non-scientific means, because that is what science itself rests on. And that's going back to the presupposition argument. So yeah.
and if somebody were to push back like, well, those are not that's not knowledge, well, then we'll be very screwed. Like
We
like
are immensely screwed.
if somebody said like, well, Joe, your pain, your knee pain is actually not knowledge. What would you say to that? Like,
I just say that's a reductio of their view. So reductio is just basically you take the consequences of a view and you show that here's a consequence of your view that I don't actually know that I'm in knee pain, and then you just say that's absurd. So your view must be false because it has this absurd consequence. So I'm just gonna say, like, if they're going to such depths that I don't know that I'm in knee pain, I'm sorry, you've gone off the deep end. Let's still let's take a step back, and I definitely know that I'm in knee pain. But also, again, if they go that way, then they're gonna have to say goodbye to lots of scientific knowledge, because scientists themselves rest on, well, psychology in order to correlate certain pain states with brain states. We learn that through MRI things, but we also have to rely on the testimony of the patient, as well as the patient's reliable introspective access to when they're in pain and when they're not in pain, right? So various elements of scientific knowledge requires us to be able to gain knowledge through introspection and hence non-scientifically. So, I mean, science itself rests on this. And I mean, like scientists also, when they're observing like the pressure gauge and so on, like they have to be aware of their mental states. And like when they're trying to remember it 5 seconds later, they have to be aware of their memory and then translate that into writing. So like again, basically anything in science is going to be relying on this. So if they're going to want to take that route, not only is it just clearly absurd, but also say goodbye to the very thing that they don't want to say goodbye to, which is basically all of science.
Yeah. I think that pretty much covers it, Joe. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you so much for. I know you're probably already in pain right now. So yeah, thank you, man. I deeply appreciate it, and I really really wish you the best at Princeton. Do you know what like what's going to be your emphasis? Like, what's your I guess your specialty?
Right now, I plan on specializing in metaphysics specifically. But I'm always open to changes of course and changes of direction during grad school. But metaphysics right now.
Yeah. Well, so then yeah, just keep me updated. And if you read any cool papers or any new books that interest you, just send them my way, and I'll definitely read them.
Awesome, will do. And thank you, my dude, for having me on. I really appreciate it, and it was a fun conversation.
Thank you, Joe. Take care, man.
All right, peace out.